want to start today's episode with a question, and I want you to answer it, not just hear it. So pause whatever you're doing, take a breath, and ask yourself, what areas of my life feel like they're unfolding slower than I expected? The follow-up question might be even harder to answer, but it's just as necessary. What areas of my life are actually going well, but I stopped noticing because I'm too focused on where I feel behind? While you take a second to think about it, I'm going to take the time to introduce myself. Hi, my name is Elijah, but you can call me Lay. Welcome back to A Little Atypical, where we dive into all things wellness, personal development, and lifestyle topics. I like to approach typical topics from a not so typical perspective, and that's exactly what we're going to do today. So going back to our little exercise, it's interesting how we can hyperfixate on the one or two things that hasn't happened yet. The career milestone, the relationship, the achievement, while overlooking all the ways we're exactly where we need to be. The truth is, there's no universal timeline for life, even though it often feels like there is. We're all, not to sound so cliche, blooming at different rates in different areas, and that's not just okay, it's completely normal. As we explore the late bloomer experience today, I want you to think about where you might be giving yourself a hard time for no reason, and where you can celebrate instead. I spoke about the inspiration behind this month's topic in episode 77, and I felt like a good place to start exploring is defining late blooming and what that looks like across categories of life. Something I was thinking about is how feeling late is such a universal experience, because people can look at certain areas of life and feel content and satisfied with where they are, but then feel late in another area and compare themselves to another person who may have what they want in the area they feel late in, but then that person may look at them and feel the same thing. So I guess what the purpose is to highlight how it's okay to not have it all together, because it doesn't mean nothing is working out for you, and to remind people that someone else may be experiencing the same feelings but in a different font. So let's start with the basics. What does it actually mean to be a quote-unquote late bloomer? Typically when we talk about late blooming, we're referring to the feeling of being behind on a societal timeline, those, unspoken milestones that society tells us that we should hit by certain ages. The whole quote unquote graduate by 22, career by 25, married by 30, kids by 35 narrative that gets passed around like it's some kind of universal law. Now, I want to be clear. Yes, we can have personal standards and timelines for ourselves, and that's completely valid, but the thing is, it's important to know where those standards actually come from. Are they truly yours, or are they just internalized versions of what you've been told you should want? Because that distinction matters. I also want to clarify that I understand that it's not always about societal timelines. Sometimes the urgency we feel is deeply personal, rooted in our own experiences and circumstances. I had a conversation with my accountability partner recently where I was describing why I used to feel such a certain urgency about everything, and how much of a relief it was to finally just feel calm going into the new year. It's not like I gave up or quote unquote surrendered intentionally, because if I'm being honest, that was always the hardest aspect of the whole manifestation, law of the universe type practice that I could never fully wrap my head around. But that's not the point. What I told her was that feeling of lateness for me was always more about my environment and my specific circumstances. My dad died when I was young, to a point where I don't remember him. And I grew up with only my mom. The pressure to do well wasn't necessarily coming from her, it was coming from me. People always talk about the older sibling experience, which is valid, but I wish in the process they wouldn't invalidate the younger sibling experience either. Being the youngest of a mother who had me at 37 years old and had to raise me and my older brother alone because my dad's death just gave me a certain anxiety that I carried for years. I was heavily aware of death and the concept of death from a young age. And because of that additional awareness, my family unit never felt whole. I was also very afraid to talk about my family most of the time because in the 2010s, people would still use stereotypes as insults. I was always self conscious about saying I didn't have a dad, even though the reason was completely out of my control because obviously death isn't controllable. But part of me still resented having a father that was dead, even though that's so logically irrational. It was like I had all these emotions swirling around, but I wasn't allowed to be angry either because of, again, stereotypes. And to be quite real, it messed with my sense of identity a lot. There will always be 50% of my DNA that I don't know about, and I can't get the answers I need fully to understand myself. But I'm getting off topic. I think having that awareness of having one parent was always there in the back of my mind. Like, what if I take too long and she doesn't get to be here when I get my dream job? What if I can't share those wins with her? What if she's not there when I get married or have kids or achieve anything I'm working towards? And I know this might sound selfish. There are so many bigger things in the world, and some people don't get to have any parents because they were either abandoned by them or both died for whatever reason. They're raised by other relatives. But I'm not trying to compare traumas. I'm just trying to explain my reasoning for feeling late or behind. So I want to research more about where else these emotions come from for other people. But for this episode, I want to focus on the emotional landscape of the late bloomer experience, how someone can feel late across different categories, the internal narratives we tell ourselves, and the external triggers that reinforce these feelings. I'll also explore the pros and cons of the late bloomer experience because it's not all negative. There are actually some unexpected reasons to taking non-traditional paths. Starting off, I'm grouping career, finances, and education together because these three areas are deeply interconnected in how we measure progress and success. Education often serves as the foundation, the prerequisite that unlocks career opportunities, which in turn shapes financial stability. Obviously, this is a general statement because I do think the other part is having good charisma and knowing how to get things that way, but that's a different story. The feeling of being late can hit especially hard across these categories because they build upon each other for the most part, creating like this domino effect where when one area is delayed, it makes everything feel delayed. And what makes these categories challenging is that they're often the most publicly visible and frequently discussed aspects in our lives. Unlike personal growth or internal shifts, these achievements are tangible, measurable, and constantly reinforced by society as indicators of quote unquote making it. Educational degrees have completion dates. Job titles appear everywhere and is the first way we introduce ourselves. Financial milestones are constantly woven into everyday conversations or about what you're constantly doing in order to make that money. When you feel behind in any of these areas, it's not just an internal struggle, it's something you're reminded of in every networking event, family gathering, graduation announcement, social media scroll. And the traditional timeline is so deeply embedded in societal expectations, even though I briefly mentioned this. So, graduate high school at 17 or 18. If you have a late birthday, it's probably 17. Finish college by 21 or 22. Land your first real job by 23. Climb the career ladder through your 20s. Maybe pursue a graduate degree by 25 and steadily build your savings and investments along the way. When your path doesn't follow this sequence, whether you're returning to school later, changing careers, or playing financial catch up, the pressure is relentless because everyone seems to have an opinion on where you should be professionally, educationally, and financially by a certain age. There's also the unique experience of being in academic spaces when you're significantly older than your classmates, which can trigger feelings of not belonging or having quote unquote wasted years. And because education often delays other milestones, the impact ripples outward, pushing back career advancement, financial stability, and even relationship timelines if you're prioritizing school over other areas of life. And some internal narratives for these categories can look like, I should be farther along in my career by now. Everyone else my age is making more money. I'm not successful enough. I haven't found my passion or purpose yet. I should be better with money by now. I'm behind on savings and investments. I should have finished my degree on time. I'm too old to go back to school. Everyone else graduated and moved on with their lives. I missed my chance to pursue higher education. And external triggers can look like LinkedIn updates showcasing promotions, salary discussion with peers, family asking about your job and education status, seeing classmates achieve major career milestones, graduation announcements from peers, financial stress when comparing your lifestyle to others, corporate ladders with age based expectations, conversations about retirement planning and financial milestones, age based academic timelines, scholarships and programs targeting younger students, family expectations about educational achievement, professional requirements, listing degree completion dates, and so on. Moving on to hobbies and passions. This category can be one of the more quietly painful because, unlike career or relationship, hobbies and passions are supposed to be fun. So, feeling late here can come with this extra layer of shame. People often feel behind when they're just discovering what they're interested in during their 20s, 30s, or beyond. While it seems like everyone else found their, quote unquote thing in childhood, I still think about this TikTok, right, from 2 years ago, where this woman was making fun of a man for getting skateboard lessons in his 20s. Things like that make people feel shame, and they shouldn't, because being able to explore things as a kid is a privilege, not only financially, but also growing up in an environment that allows you to nurture those things. Imagine being a kid bullied so badly that you couldn't even really develop interest because all you did was go home, sleep, and try your best in school because that's all you could manage. Internal narratives in this category looks like, I should have developed these skills years ago. It's too late to start something new. I'm not talented enough because I didn't start young. Everyone else is already an expert. External triggers can look like social media highlighting prodigies or young achievers, seeing people monetize their hobbies, watching others win awards or recognition, cultural narratives about finding your passions early in life. Next categories I'm grouping together are beliefs, mindset, and mental health. And these categories are the most complex to navigate because beliefs, mindset, and mental health are deeply influenced by culture, upbringing, generational patterns, often in ways we don't recognize until much later in life anyways. The feeling of quote unquote being late in this area can be heavy because it's not just about you. It's about unlearning what was passed down to you, sometimes across multiple generations. And what makes this category especially challenging is that, unlike career or relationships, there's no clear finish line. You can't, quote unquote, complete your mental health journey or achieve the perfect mindset. It's ongoing, evolving work that looks different for everyone based on their unique cultural context, family history, personal experiences. So feeling late here often isn't actually about being behind. It's about comparing your chapter 1 to someone else's chapter 10 without acknowledging that you're reading completely different books. And it's not meant to sound cheesy. It's just in this space, especially, you only know what you know. And it does take a lot of courage to build and challenge your belief system. And internal narratives can look like, I should have healed from this by now. Why am I still struggling with the same patterns? Everyone else seems to have it figured out mentally and emotionally. And I do think this is a unique area because external triggers are more common because these topics used to be more taboo. But some external triggers for this area could look like therapy culture on social media making healing look linear, or if not even just linear, making it kind of seem like an aesthetic more than anything else. They often beautify it, romanticize it, and when your process doesn't look like that, it kind of makes you question, like, am I even doing this thing right? Because all the, I'm going to say girlies, but y'all know it's different people, but mostly the girlies turn it into a vibe. They turn it into this thing where it's like a style. It's the things you do. It's going to Pilates. It's switching to like specific diet. It's cycle syncing. It's all these things. And if you're not doing those things, it makes it seem like, oh, you're not healing properly. It's addition to that, self-help content suggesting quick fixes. It's people sharing their quote-unquote glow-up stories. It's the wellness industry's emphasis on constant growth and improvement. And that is the last note I had to say on that category. Next is friendship and community. Friendship and community can feel uniquely isolating to navigate in the late bloomer experience because there's no clear path to catch up. Friendships are organic and they can't be forced. People often feel behind when they lack a core friend group, watch others have their people, or start from scratch in their 20s, 30s, or beyond. I feel like there's an important connection going back to hobbies and passions. If you're discovering your hobbies and passions late in life, you might also find authentic relationships later too. Because when you haven't fully engaged with who you are, it's difficult to attract people who resonate with your true self. As you discover your genuine interest and identity, you naturally begin connecting with people who align with the real you, not the version of you that you thought you should be. And sometimes taking longer to find your people means you find the right people. Internal narratives for this area looks like, I should have a solid friend group by now. Why is it so hard for me to maintain friendships? Everyone else has their people. I'm too old to be making new friends. External triggers can look like group photos on social media, wedding parties full of lifelong friends, people talking about their quote-unquote day ones, seeing tight-knit communities you're not part of, cultural emphasis of having a crew, squad, whatever term they're using now, not to sound old, but I was the era of the squad goals. So anyways, next is aesthetics and personal style. This category is often overlooked but can carry a significant weight, especially when visual self-expression becomes tied to identity and confidence. People can feel late when they're still figuring out their personal aesthetics in their 20s and 30s, not knowing what clothing styles feel authentic, experimenting with something like makeup for the first time as an adult, or finally exploring hair colors and styles that they were too afraid to try earlier. There's often shame around caring about external appearances because people dismiss it as shallow or vain. But I think what makes a person the most confident is skills. And the skill of curation absolutely creates your confidence. Being able to curate personal aesthetics to understand what works for you and express yourself visually is a legitimate skill that impacts how you move through the world and how you feel in your own skin. And when you're developing that skill later than the people around you, it could feel like you're playing catch up in an area that seems to come effortlessly to everyone else. Internal narratives can look like, I should know what my style is by now. I'm too old to be experimenting with my looks. Everyone else looks put together and I'm still figuring it out. I missed the window to develop my aesthetic. External triggers could look like social media's curated aesthetics, fashion trends that seem age specific, style evolution content, influencers with signature looks, and before and after transformations. Next area, health and hygiene. These categories encompasses both physical health and basic hygiene routines. Surprisingly, people can feel late in both areas. On the health side, there's the feeling of starting fitness journeys to quote unquote too late. Finally learning what proper portion sizes actually looks like. Understanding the long-term harm of a mostly ultra-processed food diet. Figuring out how to shop strategically so cooking at home becomes more affordable than ordering out. Learning basic cooking skills you feel like you should have developed years ago, or addressing health issues you ignored in your 20s. But equally significant is the hygiene aspect, which often goes unacknowledged in these conversations. In my head, health and hygiene are hand in hand. I feel like in order to be healthy, you need good hygiene. But what I never thought about until recently is how differently families teach hygiene. At a young age, my mom was already teaching me how to take my own showers, about the different products used, like deodorant and soaps and all that stuff, right? And all these different hygiene things. But after doing more of a deep dive on social media, I learned that for some people that wasn't common in some households. I think that's part of why things like shower talk or people sharing their feminine hygiene routine videos got so popular on social media, because for some people these basics weren't taught early or thoroughly. And there's shame in learning quote unquote basic hygiene practices as an adult, whether it's skincare routines, dental care beyond just brushing, proper hair care, or body care practices you feel like you should have known years ago. Internal narratives looks like, I should have established healthy habits earlier. My body should be in better shape by now. I'm starting too late to see real results. Everyone else prioritized their health before I did. I wasted my younger years not taking care of myself. And external triggers for these categories could look like fitness transformations on social media, wellness culture's emphasis on youth and starting early, diet culture messaging about quote unquote damage being irreversible, people discussing their long-term health routines that they've maintained for years, influencers sharing their decade-long fitness journeys, content about athletes or fitness enthusiasts who started training as children, body care and hygiene content labeled as quote-unquote basics everyone should know, influencers sharing their morning and evening routines, shower talk and hygiene routine videos that reveals gaps in your own knowledge, product recommendations for routines you haven't established, comments like, wait, people don't know about this on hygiene posts, and so on. Moving on to our last area is dating, romance, and sexual exploration. This is one of the most emotionally charged categories because romantic relationships are so heavily tied to societal timelines and milestones. People feel late when they haven't been in a serious relationship by a certain age, when they're still figuring out what they want in a partner while people around them are getting engaged, or when they're experiencing quote unquote first that society expects you to have had so much earlier. However, I want to clarify that I see the sexual aspects as separate from the romantic aspects of relationships. As I mentioned last week when discussing the inspiration for this topic, just because people pursue romance and dating doesn't mean they're exploring the sexual aspects of a relationship. These are two distinct experiences that can overlap, but don't always follow the same timeline. Sexual experiences and exploration represents one of the most private categories where people can feel behind, yet it's really discussed openly. The shame around this topic runs deep because there's an assumption that everyone figures out their sexuality and it gains experiences during specific life stages. And if you don't, you might feel like you missed out on a critical development window. Internal narratives looks like I should have had a serious relationship by now. Everyone else has figured out what they want in a partner. I'm too old to be experiencing these relationship first. I've missed the window for finding someone. Something must be wrong with me if I'm still single at this age. I should be more experienced by now. Everyone else figured this out years ago. It's too late to explore or learn. I missed out on important formative experiences. There's something wrong with me for not knowing what I want or need. External triggers could look like wedding invitations, engagement announcements, romantic relationship milestones on social media, family questions about your dating life, Valentine's Day and other couple-centric holidays, friends discussing long-term partners, cultural narratives about finding quote-unquote the one by a certain age, dating apps in general, cultural assumptions about when people become sexually active, media portrayal of sexuality and experiences tied to youth, conversations where people reference their histories or preferences, societal messaging about quote-unquote normal development timelines. Now that we explored how feeling late manifests across life categories, let's talk about the actual experience of what society calls a quote-unquote late bloomer. Because here's the thing, it's not all negative, and there are actually some surprising benefits to taking the non-traditional path. So I'm going to start with the cons to get the hard stuff out the way. And it's just going to be a straight list of things I thought about. But yeah. So first up is constant comparison. You're always acutely aware of where others are in relation to where you are, which can be, mentally and emotionally exhausting. Social pressure. And what I mean by this is even though sometimes it's well-meaning and other times it's not so well-meaning, you get a lot of questions from family, friends, even strangers about like your life choices and your timeline, self-doubt, of course, that internal voice that questions whether you're on the right path or if you somehow failed by not hitting certain milestones. Financial stress, starting a career path or education later can mean delayed financial stability, and it can kind of feel like a game of catch up, and especially pertaining to things like savings and investments. Feeling isolated. So this one, it's either emotionally you feel isolated or it physically happens, because when your timeline doesn't match people around you, it can feel lonely and like you don't quite fit in anywhere. And when you kind of have that mindset, it either forces you to stay by yourself and isolate yourself until you feel like you're good enough to be around those people, or sometimes it's a lot of pretending around people. So it's either you actually do isolate yourself or you just feel isolated emotionally. Then, of course, you get imposter syndrome. So entering spaces where you feel less experienced than others can trigger feelings of not belonging or being legitimately good enough to be there. Next, navigating age gaps. So being in spaces where you're significantly older or younger than people can kind of create this awkwardness and feeling of not fitting in with either group. Time pressure. I talked about this a lot, but the awareness that certain opportunities, experiences, or paths may become more challenging or unavailable the longer you wait. And of course, the most exhausting one, which is explaining your path. So the constant need to justify or explain where you're at, your timeline, to others who expect conventional progression. The pros, the first thing I thought of was a little more self-awareness. When you take longer to reach certain milestones, you often have time to understand yourself more and what you actually want, why you want it, and kind of navigate strategies of what works for you. And moving on to build on that is intentionality. So those who follow non-traditional timelines tend to be more, I guess, deliberate about their choices because they've had enough time to observe what works and what doesn't work outside them, like for others, and then see how it applies to themselves. Then next is overall resilience. So navigating a non-traditional path builds like this certain quote unquote mental toughness, and it pushes you to be more adaptable. That serves you well in all areas of life. In addition to that, your perspective is another pro, because when you've experienced enough to have a broader view of what really matters, it can lead to more fulfilling choices. And to add on to that, people who experience late blooming are less likely to settle, because when you've taken your time, like I said, this connects back to intentionality. So you're often more selective and less willing to accept situations that truly don't serve you. You also have very unique insights. So a nonlinear path gives you experiences and perspectives that people who follow traditional timelines might not have. It also makes you have a higher sense of appreciation, because when things do happen for you, there's often this deeper sense of gratitude and appreciation because you understand the journey it took to get there. Another pro I wanted to add is breaking patterns. So those who follow alternative timelines often end up creating new templates and showing others that different paths are not just valid, but they could be rewarding. So it kind of changes the mindset and allows other people to be inspired by their journey. And the last one I wanted to mention is freedom from regret. Because when you take a non-traditional path, it means you're less likely to look back wondering, what if? Because you've given yourself permission to explore and figure things out on your own timeline. The late bloomer experience in general is complex. It comes with real challenges, but I hope this section showed you it also has like these unexpected gifts. And understanding both sides helps us see that taking a non-traditional path isn't simply good or bad. There's nuance, it's deeply personal, and ultimately shaped by how we choose to interpret our own journey, which is why the mindset around late blooming is important to explore. While this episode focused primarily on how late blooming feels across categories by examining both internal psychology and external societal pressures, the next episodes will explore why the late blooming process experience occurs before moving into more practical strategies for navigating this experience. So be sure to tune in for the rest of this month's series as we work towards a deeper understanding and conclusion, because I do want to touch more on the psychology behind why we feel late, examine like the cultural and societal factors that create these timelines in the first place, and most importantly, explore practical ways to reframe your relationship with time and progress. So before completely ending this episode, I want to be clear about something that I've deliberately been saying throughout this episode, the late bloomer experience, rather than late bloomers, because it's not just a stylistic choice, it's intentional. Because even though the theme of this month is to normalize late blooming, I want to clarify that I'm normalizing it as an experience and not an identity. This distinction is important to me because identifying as a quote unquote late bloomer feels like admitting there's a fixed timeline that we're late for. I just don't believe that's true. So let me bring this back to what we've been discussing throughout the episode, the feelings associated with late blooming. We've explored how the late bloomer experience shows up emotionally across the different life categories, from career, finances, health, education, romance, and more. But the point of examining all those internal narratives and external triggers was so you can understand that those feelings are valid responses to societal pressure and not reflection of objective failure. The reason why I don't want to claim late bloomer as an identity, because it keeps us connected to urgency, and I don't value urgency. I made that very clear in last month's perspective. I value intentional action, curiosity, and experimentation. So, how can you really put a timeline on results? You can set timelines for collecting data points, for testing whether one approach, strategy, or idea works for you. But all of those things are hypothesis. Most beautiful thing about that is the fact that we can always create another one. Design something new. Learn from the experiment that didn't yield the results you wanted. Life itself is the experiment, and you can't time when you'll finally reach the conclusions you're seeking. This is why the emotional weight of quote-unquote being late can feel so heavy, because we're trying to force certainty and completion onto a process that is inherently uncertain and ongoing. Instead of identifying as a late bloomer, I identify as someone who's intentional, someone who has developed certain skills that makes areas of life easier while actively learning others. I identify as someone who has morals and beliefs and stands by them, but who is also open enough to explore the why behind them and allow them to evolve when it resonates. I identify as someone not limited by labels. I can edit them as I please. Right now, I identify with being creative, analytical, spiritual, open, kind, honest, and evolving. So, as we wrap up today's exploration on how late blooming feels, I want you to sit with this. What if the discomfort you feel isn't about being late at all? What if it's about being caught between who society says you should be by now and who you're intentionally becoming? The late blooming experience is real, the emotions are valid, but they don't define your worth or determine your destination. And I'm just going to leave that food for thought here and give a quick little update and then a card pull. So speaking of intentional paths and non-traditional timelines, I want to share a personal example of how I'm actively working to build community in adulthood. Something that I mentioned that can feel like its own version of late blooming when you're doing it outside of the traditional structures of school or early career. This update will connect back to what we've been discussing, because building meaningful friendships and finding your people as an adult often doesn't follow a neat timeline that we experienced growing up. There's no built-in social structure handing you a friend group, so you have to be intentional about creating those connections. As I mentioned, I joined a book club in January and I was really excited about it. I technically missed the first meeting on the 4th, but made it to the 11th, which was funny because it was technically 1111 day, since 2026 in numerology is a year 1, and then the 18th, which was our second meeting, was the Capricorn new moon. The second meeting was pretty much really fun because the conversation was more about ways we evolved, where we are at in life. Technically, we did speak about the book too, but it was more focused on those themes. Anyways, so we get to star signs and everything. The person who created the book club was like, they are a Cancer sun, Taurus rising, and Aquarius moon. And then the other person who was there and also carrying the conversation as well, they had similar placements and they were a Cancer sun, Libra rising, Aquarius moon. And I found that to be insane because I don't know, I always had this pattern where Aquarius placements, sun or moon, but especially moon, always have this signal that a transformation will happen soon for me. My old friend was an extrovert who adopted me, and I did get the experience of having different friendships due to her social energy. And even though a lot happened, I can always say that was a connection that transformed me. After I did experience a male Aquarius moon, At least I think that was his sign, because one thing about moon signs is you can technically guess them as long as it's a day where the moon wasn't in transition. So I'm 98% sure he was. And despite it being a bad experience, it did transform me as well. And then a connection that was forming in 2024. He was a Cancer sun, Leo rising, and Aquarius moon. And what I will say is that I wasn't ready to fully engage with that connection because it was kind of scary how similar we were. And I think I still had to shed things emotionally. But if I did feel ready to engage with that connection, the synastry was insane because he would have planets that fell into my first house, second house, and eighth house based on what I knew about his birth chart. And I had planets that fell into his 12th house, third house, fifth house, sixth house, seventh house, and eighth. Specifically, my Lilith would fall into his eighth. I talked about this, but 2025 was a year of shedding. And I think with these potential new connections, and yes, I like to look at synastry for friendships too, the organizer's placements fell into my first, 8th, and 11th house. So identity, transformation / death and rebirth, which is funny because how much we talk about spirituality, and 11th house, which is the house of community and friendship and network, while the other person is first house, fourth house, and eighth house. So I just reflected because whenever I interact with people whose moon are in my eighth house, I just know a change is happening. And the thing is, I felt this vibe going into the new year. So it just feels like confirmation, like, yeah, I'm right and tapped in. Now, I don't know how I'm going to transform or what it is, but I'm holding space for it because I'm ready to evolve in whatever way I need to. I wanted to add that in because I know being in the messy middle and feeling behind is so real, which is why I hope sharing this helps encourage you to trust in the process for yourself as well. And before next week's episode, one thing I want to encourage you to do, like an action, is identify one area where you feel late or behind, and then look at the synastry of that situation. You don't have to do it necessarily astrologically if that's not what you believe in, but the alignment between where you are and what you're actually building towards. Just like how I'm noticing patterns with my connections, with Aquarius moon placements, signaling transformation, what patterns are present in your own journey. Make sure to write down one way your current timeline might actually be preparing you for something meaningful. Sometimes we're not late, we're just right on time for a transformation we didn't even know we needed. So now let's transition into this week's card pull. Remember, if card pulls aren't your thing and this is where you usually click off, thank you for listening so far, and be sure to come back next week and follow the podcast so you can stay up to date with the new episodes. So today we're using the Moonology deck, and the card we got is the Gibbous Moon. You're very close to achieving your goal. The word gibbous means bulging. What a descriptive word, right? And pulling this card at any time of the month suggests that the situation you're asking about is bulging with possibility and coming to a peak. But this isn't an ending card with a neat yes or no answer. Rather, you're being reminded that some adjustments may yet be required before you get what you want, though you're certainly on the right track, which hopefully is reassuring for you. However, there is also a sense that the situation is a bit tense, so don't push too hard. One false move and the whole thing could blow. That's not meant to scare you. It's just to let you know there's a fuse attached to this situation, so be careful if you choose to light it. Attuned to the moon. I know I'm on the right track. Additional meanings for this card. Now is a good time to review your plans. Keep the momentum going as you move towards your dreams. Stay focused. It's a good time to start a new project. You need to get back into good, healthy habits. The teaching. gibbous moon comes at the very end of the lunar cycle, just before the full moon. She looks like she's bulging because she's almost a full moon, so she's nearly fully rounded. It's the accumulation of the waxing cycle, and as such tends to be a rather intense period of the month. No matter when you pull this card, it suggests a very ripe time and a very ripe situation. The gibbous moon perfectly mirrors the core message of this episode, that feeling quote-unquote late doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're in the intense transformative space right before a breakthrough. Just as the gibbous moon represents being quote-unquote bulging with possibilities, yet requiring careful adjustments rather than forced urgency, the late bloomer experience asks us to trust our intentional pace while resisting the pressure to rush towards arbitrary timelines. The card's reminder that you're on the right track reinforces that non-traditional paths aren't delays. They're deliberate journeys towards destinations that unfold in their own time. And that's all for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode of A Little Atypical. If you found this helpful, don't forget to subscribe and share this with someone who might need to hear this message. Remember, view the description box where you can find important links such as the one to my website, where there's so much more bonus content, and other links such as the one to my Substack. So until next time, have a good day, evening, or night, and stay authentically atypical. Okay, bye!